At this time, I would like to introduce Lisa Westman. She is a practitioner. She gets down in the weeds with this work, and she has a perspective that will help us make further sense of the work that we are getting ready to do. So again, thank you for being here. Love this big crowd. So excited to have you. And enjoy the last few days of summer as much as you can. All right, please help me welcome Lisa.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. How are you? Someone said they were awake this morning, so that was a good sign. I agree. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about my professional credentials in a second, but I always like to begin with introducing who I am outside of education, which is a wife and a mother. So this is my family. That's my husband, Keith. He is a former third grade teacher, principal, technology coordinator, now works in ed tech. Our son, Keller, who will start 8th grade in a couple of weeks. Our daughter, Mallory, who will start 5th grade in a couple of weeks. And our dog, Darcy, who is my favorite. Don't tell my kids, but she never talks back to me, so it's a good thing. So I taught 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, gifted humanities, social studies, ELA, one course of STEM in there for some reason, those poor kids. And then I was a differentiation instructional coach. I never had any intention of becoming a speaker and author, which I'll tell you a little bit more about in a second, until I had Keller. So I'm going to tell you one quick story about him, which kind of will give you an idea of how I got here today. And it happened the day he was born. So the day Keller was born, all of my friends said, when you have the baby, send him or her to the nursery at night after you feed them, and the nurses will take care of him and bring him back, 3 to 4 hours later, and you can get some sleep. And I was like, perfect, sounds great. So I feed Keller, send him to the nursery. 30 minutes later, I hear the cart coming down the hallway. Sounds like it's getting closer to my room. Door to my room opens, and there's Keller. And I say to the nurse, oh no, I just fed him 30 minutes ago. And she said, oh, I know, but he's crying so loudly, he's keeping all of the other babies up, he can't stay in the nursery. And I was like, oh great, he already got kicked out of his first classroom setting. So, needless to say, Keller stayed true to form. And he really struggled in school. He was very bright, he is very bright, but he was that kid that wouldn't sit still, questioned everything, really made teachers' lives difficult. And as a teacher myself, I vowed to never be that parent and email or call my children's teachers incessantly demanding things. And then I had a kid that didn't like school, and I really wasn't sure what to do about it. So I started blogging, which is really just a passive-aggressive means of sharing what I wanted to say to the teachers, but I didn't say it directly. And the blog eventually got picked up by Edweek. I started writing for Edweek, and eventually Corwin Publishing called and said, hey, we like that post you wrote on differentiation. Will you write a book? And I was like, I think I said everything I know in those 1,000 words that I wrote, but sure. So I wrote Student-Driven Differentiation. I am a practitioner. I have never been an administrator. I only know differentiation, standards, reference grading, all of the different things you do from your perspective. So what I try to do, what my goal is to make things actionable and remove all of those extra pieces that just confuse everybody. So I have a much more slimmed down version of everything we do, and we're going to go through a little of that today. So first, by the way, when I say differentiation, it's not something different than standards reference grading. Differentiation is the means to standards reference grading. Standards reference grading is how we report out on our differentiated efforts. Our differentiated instruction efforts are reported out through standards reference grading. There is absolutely no difference. In fact, in districts where an initiative might be differentiation without standards reference grading, it's exponentially harder to differentiate and report in a traditional grading system. So on that note, go ahead and take a look at this meme. Has anyone ever felt like this, or maybe had a colleague that felt like this at some point in their careers? If you raise your hand, we can just assume it's your colleague, not you, so you're not outing yourself. No one in this room has ever been confused? We can move on. I have a feeling that sometimes we are told things and we aren't 100% sure of what that actually means, looks like, or how we do it. And as teachers, is evident by the lack of hands that are going up, we aren't always given the luxury of sharing, hey, I don't know what that is. Because we're sometimes afraid of getting responses like, we've been talking about this for a long time and you should know it. So if you are not comfortable with any of the topics today, that's kind of why we're here. And on the note of not really understanding something and being okay saying it, I'm gonna play a voicemail from my grandma. This is June Richards. She'll turn 94 next week. When I sent her a copy of my book last summer, she left me a voicemail, and I'm gonna play that for you. It's 30 seconds long. The first 20 seconds, she sounds like a doting grandma. That's not why I'm playing it. Just wait for the last 10 seconds.
I was Cincinnati just calling to tell you how proud I am of you. Honey, that book is marvelous. I can't get over it. I've been going through slowly and trying to understand as much as I can. You're wonderful. I love you. I love you. I love you. And I wish you only the best and hope that it takes off really good. Just tell me how you pronounce the word. I can't figure it out. Different something, the title. So I'll talk to you again soon. I love you, love you, love you, and good luck always. Okay.
So your book is so great, but what is the title? I have no idea. So, yeah, I think she does a nice job of really summing up how we all act sometimes and feel. And on that note, I plan on sharing many of my failed attempts at things with you today. And I also plan on embedding as many instructional strategies into our 3 hours that you can take back and share with your colleagues and use in your own classrooms. So one of those activities is an opinion lineup. So I'll explain the activity, we'll go through it. These are all provisional to use however you would like. If you want more information on any of these, I have some pieces of information up here that you can take a picture of, or I can add to a file. There are agendas on all of the tables. You can go ahead and leave them there. There's just one per table. But there is a link on the agenda that houses a Google folder of the presentation today, all of the materials. So when you go back to your colleagues, if you want to use any pieces of this presentation, feel free. Okay, so opinion lineup can be used as a pre-assessment or a formative assessment at any point, depending on what you put on either end. Today we're going to line up with your personal feelings on how effective you feel currently with standards reference grading practices. So what we're going to do is we're going to line up in this space at the front of the room. If you struggle with some of the ideals of standards reference grading, which is not to say that you don't believe in them, but you're struggling with how to effectively implement them, you're going to stand up closer to this end of the room. If you have found effective ways to implement standards reference grading in your classrooms, line up closer to that end of the room. What we will do eventually is fold the line, so people on this end will wind up chatting with people closer to this end, and the middle will fill in. So you don't need to bring anything with you except for yourself. Just find a place in line that best represents where you're at. If you're struggling a little bit, closer to that end. If you're feeling more confident, closer to that end. If you want to just spread out this way, I know no one ever wants to go all the way down. We can go ahead and spread out. Hi. Okay, so when I put my hand up today, if you see my hand up and you put your hand up, that will be our symbol to come back. I was a middle school teacher. I've seen a lot of people make like waterfall noises and things like that. I can't do that. I get too embarrassed. So this is the best I can do. So thank you. Okay, so what we're going to do is fold in the line. So would you mind just being my example on this end? And lady in the pink, will you come be my, just all you're doing is walking toward each other. That's it. Don't worry. So you two are going to be plot partners, and you're just going to share, why did you choose your spot in line? If you struggle, why do you struggle? If you found success, how? And if you're somewhere in the middle, why? So it's not going to be perfect, but just start folding in the line and find a partner from another side. We can use the whole room now to chat. Take about 2 to 3 minutes to chat with your new thought partner. If you don't know them, please introduce yourself. One of the common topics that we'll talk about today is the role that student ownership, student reflection plays in standards reference grading. So this activity, should you ever want to get a feel of where students are at as far as their understanding or their interest in a topic you are teaching, this is a strategy that could easily be used that also involves some movement, which is helpful for students. I will never force anyone to share any information the whole day today. However, I will ask for volunteers from time to time, and then my goal is wait time. I've been working on it for like 10 years, so hopefully I'll get there one day. But would anybody like to share something that they learned from chatting with your partner? Something you learned about either a struggle or an effective strategy with standards reference grading that you just learned about a new perspective. Thank you. And tell me your name.
Stephanie Schultz.
Stephanie.
The partner that I had was from Anderson, and she said that she's been doing project-based learning, and that the scales that she's been doing for progress-based learning meld well with the rubrics and whatnot for standard service grading.
Terrific. Thank you. Anybody else want to share? Thank you. What's your name? Okay.
Hi, my partner and I talked about, we're both kind of in the same boat, where after last year we had an in-service demo or a staff meeting demo where we all looked at the One Girls paper and rated it in a regular way, and then we looked at it with SRG, and it was so powerful how everybody came up with the same grade with SRG. And this will be year 19 for me, and this just kind of hit me really hard. I love what I'm seeing so far. I wonder how it's going to look in kindergarten, though.
I get that all the time, like, how's this look in kindergarten? And we're going to talk about that. In fact, if you take a look at the screen, I had shared a survey, a questionnaire with you about what are your wishes for our workshop today and what are some questions that you have. This is a compiled list. There were way more responses, but these represent the answers and the wishes that we saw over and over. And by we, I mean one of my colleagues and I. So if you go ahead and look, and I can tell you a couple of questions on the left, but what are district expectations about the frequency of grading and what is to be graded? How to build student-friendly SRGs? What resources will we have? What about the workload issue? What is a body of evidence? Lots and lots of similar themes. And we will cover all of these questions throughout the next couple of hours. If I do not go in detail enough about a question, let's stop and chat about it. We don't need to get through everything that I have. Less is more. So let's go through each step, and then as you have questions, we'll answer them. If you have a question that is very specific to you, for instance, I teach PE, and in our basketball unit, I'm wondering X. If you just jot that down on a little sheet of paper and leave it in the middle of the table, I'll either come and find you, or if you put your email address on there, I will respond to you at some point within the next couple of days. Okay, moving on. I'll give you a little bit of history, which is going to help us understand a little bit more of why we are making this shift, and then how to overcome some of the, I call them, ailments of the old model. So why do we even have letter grades, or why did we have letter grades? So in the late 1800s, the United States went from being a largely farming country to an industrialized country, and factories were popping up all over. And so parents, instead of working on their land, were going to factories to work. And there needed to be a place for their kids to go during the day. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, school was not compulsory, it was optional. When the Industrial Revolution hit, all of a sudden school became compulsory, largely as a means to take care of children. But there needed to be a way to report out on what students did at the time. We had very, very basic forms of, one, teaching and assessing, and two, communicating. So if you think about what was happening in a factory, assembly lines, things like that, the emphasis at the time was produce the same thing at the fastest rate, faster than the person next to you if possible. And we want it to all look the same. And then a way to grade that would be, you got 8 out of 10, you got 9 out of 10, right? You're missing this piece on yours, that's a point off. So we replicated that in our schools. Grade A meat, the highest grade of meat, grade A in schools. But over time, as we've researched and learned more about how students learn and have the means to communicate in a more effective way, we've learned that this system is not necessarily the best system. But that doesn't mean that this is an easy switch that people come along with. Oh, sure, okay, let's just change everything. So this is a bumper sticker that doesn't really exist, but I used it in a blog post as an image once because my sister called me, her children are a little bit older than mine. She called me panicking. At the time, her twin daughters were in 7th grade, and she said, I hate standards-based grading. My daughters were all above average, and standards-based grading made them average. I was like, well, Paula, it doesn't really make them average, and I tried to explain, you know, there's not like an equal system, and did the whole thing, and she was like, well, my kid's teacher thinks it's stupid too. And I was like, okay. Because standards-based grading is part of our identity as adults. For 98% of teachers, almost 100% of parents, and certainly grandparents, we all went to school with a traditional grading system. That feels normal to us. It also became part of our identity. We were a good student, we were not a good student. It's bragging rights for your friends. Oh, my daughter was on the honor roll. What about yours? Standards reference grading removes some of those pieces. It also has implications for people's identities. Parents, teachers, everyone. And that's okay. We're gonna try and work through those, but if you feel yourself having some of that, it makes sense. So stick with that for a second. There are 2 holdovers from the factory model, which we as practitioners or administrators in individual school districts have little, if any, control over. So we need to kind of work around those. So I'm going to talk about those 2 right now, which may help alleviate some nerves that you have. The first are deadlines. I don't know what the deadline is in the state of Kansas. I'm from Chicago and Illinois. August 31st is the cutoff. So any child that is born between September 1st and August 31st of any given school year starts kindergarten when they turn 5. You all have a date like that? Okay. So we have students that are 364 days apart potentially that all have learned to walk, talk, fend for themselves at different stages, different times over the past 5 years. And we celebrate their milestones. And then students get to kindergarten and we say, read on Friday, all of you. And everything drastically changes. Differentiation, standards reference grading, alleviates that pressure. Now, practically speaking, we still need to report out. We only have a given amount of time. How do we compensate for those things? Standards are written as year-long standards. We typically teach them during one quarter or one trimester, but we can go back, we can revisit. That's why we keep track of where students are at. The second holdover, which is really the biggest issue when it comes to standards reference grading, are report cards. Thinking back to that factory model, report cards were sent home. The only way we really had to communicate was through the mail or through sending a piece of paper home with students, reporting out a couple of times a year. Very, very basic reporting. So I like to think of report cards. We can't get rid of them. They're mandatory in every state. Different states have different rules with how many times and what needs to be included, but you still need to have a report card. So I like to have everyone think of report cards from now on as bank statements. How many of you have an online account to your bank? You can log on to your phone app, your online app, and at any point see what your balance is. So almost everybody. That is what report cards are now. Banks are still required to send a formal bank statement each month. The second that bank statement is printed, it becomes obsolete because I can withdraw or deposit money at any given point. It's an ongoing cycle. It's just an arbitrary date. So it's just a way to look at your account, same way that we look at learning. I know you'll all be training with Otis later. Otis is like that online banking system. It's just a way for students and parents and teachers to all communicate and see live learning where you're at any given point, including sometimes when you have students that are up and down, just like my bank account is frequently up and down, a lot of times it's down. Which brings me to my next point. Well, what if a student isn't doing well and a parent doesn't check the online account? Well, not that I've ever been overdrawn on my bank account, but I've heard from my friends that have been that when you're overdrawn, the bank will text you, they will call you, they will email you. They will make sure that you know. We can do the same things with our students. If we know a parent isn't checking and a student is overdrawn, which means they're really not making progress, we can call the parent, we can email the parent, we can try other means to get in touch with that parent. So from here on out, if we can think about report cards as just this obsolete document that gets sent and really look at where the live learning is, it will alleviate some of those things of, I have to know everything about this standard at this date. Because we can go back and we can do reteaching. The standards are all interconnected or largely interconnected. We have lots of time, lots more time to meet student needs when we don't think about the arbitrary end of quarter or trimester dates. What exactly is learning? Before we can talk about our students' learning, what is learning? So take about a minute with the people sitting at your table, turn and talk. What is learning? Right, so go ahead and thank your table mates. If you are willing to share what you or someone else at your table define learning as, go ahead and raise your hand. If you're willing to share what you or someone at your table define learning as, raise your hand. Thank you. I'm coming to you. I feel like Oprah when I do this. It's like really fun. Okay.
You look like Oprah.
Oh, I do?
She said that it's a progression of development with content and knowledge from birth to the time of youth to away, but it definitely goes in stages as the children's and adult brain develops.
I like that. Anyone else want to share? Thank you for helping me work on my goal, my weight to end goal. Thank you.
We just kept it short and sweet and said that it is gaining new knowledge or skills of something you didn't previously know.
Awesome. Thank you. Go ahead and take a look at this quote. Sorry, my clicker won't work. I'll read the quote to you in case you can't see with the lights. In my early schooling, I made some friends. I went to birthday parties and learned to bike with training wheels, and that was basically it. It wasn't until 6th grade that I discovered I was supposed to learn while at school. Prior to that realization, I just enjoyed hanging out with people and going through the motions of classwork, and then going home to voraciously read about topics of interest. So David is now 25. He graduated high school when he was 16, went to MIT, graduated undergrad when he was 18, went to Harvard Business School, graduated when he was 20. Profoundly gifted student, super nice kid, never complained, always had a smile on his face, yet didn't make the connection until 6th grade that school was about learning. What happened in 6th grade? In 6th grade, David's reading teacher, ELA teacher, recognized that David was flying through all of the class material. And the teacher said to David, "How are you getting things done so quickly?" And he said, "Oh, I know a lot of this already." And the teacher said, "Well, what do you do when you go home every day?" And David said, "Oh, I read my parents' physics textbooks." So clearly intelligence ran in that family. And the teacher said, "Why don't you bring those textbooks to school tomorrow? You can read those in here. This is an ELA class, you can read them." That teacher didn't know anything about physics, but he did know what skills he was trying to develop in his students. Critical thinking, synthesizing information, and he knew that that could be done with any reading material. That's a very basic form of standards reference grading. Go ahead and take a look at this comic. Being a teacher is quite an interesting role because the emphasis, the title of what we do is teach. There's nothing about learning in our title. Our job for the longest time has been to teach, regardless of if students learn. Now, many of us want students to learn, so we ensure that they do, again, using some of the strategies and methods that were used when we went to school, but we aren't necessarily focusing on the growth, the learning, and the sustainability of that learning. How many of you teach like 3rd, 4th, 5th grade? Anyone ever go over to the middle school and hear like, they don't know this, they were supposed to learn this in 4th grade? Okay, in middle school, you go to high school, they're supposed to learn this in middle school, they don't know it? This is because we do a lot of teaching, a lot of checking right in the moment, and we aren't looking to see whether or not those skills are actually developed the way that they need to be. That is what student-driven differentiation and standards reference grading are. We are shifting the focus from what students do to what and how students learn. So instead of, we are completing this activity, you have this paper due Friday, your math homework is due tomorrow, it's, we're focusing on multiplying and dividing, or whatever it is. And you'll have many opportunities to practice and learn until we see that you are understanding. And the students that understand more quickly, we differentiate up for them, and the students that need more opportunity, we give them additional opportunities. The way I like to think about this is conducting orchestras, not trains. You can read the quote up there if you want. But when I first became a differentiation instructional coach, I had taught gifted for several years, so differentiation was something that I naturally did. A lot of special education teachers, you naturally do this too because your population of students has already been identified as needing something entirely different. For the general education teacher, this is not necessarily a common practice. And so as a coach, I really struggled with going into classrooms and working with teachers because I was like, I think they're doing a great job. I don't even know what you do with 30 students at all different places and all different needs. How does this work? And then I visited some music classrooms, orchestra, band. Anybody in here music or orchestra or band? A couple people. And when I was in this orchestra classroom, I was like, oh, this is differentiation. There are students playing different instruments at different levels, if you think first chair, second chair, etc. But everybody in this room knows what the end goal looks like. Everybody knows how to participate in that final performance. And they won't all be at the same level. They'll be proficient by performance day, but they won't all be at the same level. They won't all be playing the same instrument. And so if we can create learning experiences in our classrooms that replicate that idea of the performance, that's another way to think about what this switch is. The next part of our session is going over the 4 areas in which you can differentiate. Again, there is no difference between differentiation and standards reference grading. Standards reference grading is just how we report out on our differentiated instructional methods. So Carol Ann Tomlinson founded differentiation, or put it on the map, I should say, about 45 years ago. And I work very closely with Carol, and if you asked her right now, how are we doing in our schools with differentiation, she would say, we have a lot of work to do, lots. She would also say, differentiation, at its simplest, is doing right by kids. So if you don't remember any of these terms, all we are talking about is doing right by kids. On that note, technically, there are 4 different categories in which you can differentiate. The content, which is what is to be learned, the process, how that information or content is acquired, the product, how students demonstrate the learning, and the learning environment, where and with whom students learn. That also includes the pieces of social emotional learning, metacognitive learning, all of those pieces that are harder to touch and feel, if that makes sense. So when Carol came up with these categories, and she's written 30-something books, what happened in a lot of schools and districts was our initiative is differentiation. Here are 4 categories. Choose one and differentiate for your students. And that didn't work, which is why it's still being talked about in workshops. So I'll tell you why. Differentiation is not an initiative. It's not a goal. It's a result. Differentiation happens when we notice a student has a need and we do something to fill that need. Differentiation is not a goal. We don't start with we differentiate. We differentiate when we know that we need to, when we have evidence to show us. Once we have that evidence, we can look at these 4 categories and determine, is one of these suitable? Typically, you're going to have to do a couple of these. And the student-driven part that really connects well with standards reference grading is bringing the students into that. Instead of planning in isolation or taking your summers to come up with leveled stations for your room for the high, medium, and low, it's plan for the standard. What is it that we are expecting students to master by the end of the school year? And then as students develop more quickly or not, adapt in one of these ways. The learning environment is the most important piece. It's the foundation for everything that's going to come next. Go ahead and take a look at that quote by Henry Ford. Sometimes it's hard to envision what something could look like when we only know one thing. So I'm going to try and give you some other ways to look at things throughout this section of our presentation. The first thing I want to talk about is relationships. Most important piece of any instructional practice is having a respectful relationship between the teacher and the students. In 2016, Russell Quaglia and Michael Corso surveyed 34,000 teachers and their students and asked them, do you have respectful relationships with your students? And 99% of the teachers said yes. Then they surveyed the students of those 34,000 teachers, and 42% of them said, no, I do not have respectful, I do not feel that I have a mutually respectful relationship with my teacher. Quite a big discrepancy, which is not to say that the teachers surveyed were misleading the researchers, but our understanding of relationships and also some instructional practices, like what is meeting or what is an A, are sometimes different. So how do we come to the same agreement or same understanding? Take a look at this quote. I'm going to show you a commercial now about it's a couple that are having a conversation to illustrate communication. And I want you to think, have you ever been in a conversation or situation like this as either or both parties?
It's just, there's all this pressure, you know? And sometimes it feels like it's right up on me and I can just feel it, like literally feel it in my head, and it's relentless. And I don't know if it's gonna stop. I mean, that's the thing that scares me the most, is that I don't know if it's ever gonna stop.
Yeah. Well, you do have a nail in your head.
It is not about the nail.
Are you sure? Because, I mean, I'll bet if we got that out of there...
Stop trying to fix it.
No, I'm not trying to fix it. I'm just pointing out that maybe the nail is causing...
You always do this. You always try to fix things when what I really need is for you to just listen.
No, see, I don't think that is what you need. I think what you need is to get the nail
See, you're
out.
not even listening now.
Okay, fine. I will listen. Fine.
It's just, sometimes it's like, there's this achy, I don't know what it is. And I'm not sleeping very well at all. And all my sweaters are snagged. I mean, all of them.
That sounds really hard.
It is. Thank you. Ow!
Come on, if you would just...
Don't.
So that nail in her head, we all have nails in our heads. That's like a pre-contemplation state of change. Implicit bias is one of those reasons why students sometimes don't feel that they are in respectful relationships with their teachers, but teachers don't see that necessarily. So I'm going to share two examples of this with you. I'll read this quote again just in case you can't see with the lights. I have selective mutism, which is a fear of talking, and the teachers who have welcomed me with open arms without trying to change me are the teachers from whom I have learned the most, because I feel valued. When we are communicating with students, we have their best interest at heart. Any teacher who wanted Josie to speak, to talk, had her best interest at heart, but they were losing sight of what was that learning criteria, what was that standard, because it isn't talking. Sure, there are a few standards that talk about communicating, and Josie can communicate, but when the focus becomes on something other than that learning, there's a breakdown in that communication. Another example, this is Brian Crooks. He is a grown adult living in Iowa City currently. And a few years back, he wrote one of those like super long Facebook posts, you know, that you see, you're like, why are you writing so much, right? Well, it was so much because it was about an experience that he had in 3rd grade. And the Chicago Tribune wound up running the post as an article. So Brian moved to Naperville, Illinois, which is a predominantly white suburb. And he was placed in the 3rd grade gifted program. He was very excited. And the teacher divided them up into groups and said, we're all gonna learn about medieval times, and your group can make a poster, and your group can make a presentation, and Brian, your group, you can do a rap. And walked away. And Brian said to his group, I don't know anything about rapping. And they were like, well, just make a poster, who cares, doesn't matter. So they make the poster, they present the poster, and the teacher says, that's a nice poster, but I was really looking forward to your rap, and I'm disappointed. Brian was 8 when that happened. And in his Facebook post, what he said was, that stuck with him and still does every single day. When he gets up in front of groups of people, when he talks to individual people, he is thinking, what assumptions are they making about me that are completely incorrect? When we have implicit bias, we all do, it's a defense mechanism, we need to try to recognize it and then use strategies to tame it. In Brian's situation, what could have changed this? Again, the shift from not what we're doing, poster, presentation, rap, to what are we learning? How the government in medieval societies impacts today's government. When the students understand the learning, what are some ways you can show us how you learn? And the students generate the list, a very short list of options. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second. Less work for all of you. You don't need 14 project descriptors. Focus on the learning. When the students understand the learning, they can come up with the ways that they can show it. This is just a brief graphic. I won't take too long. In addition to proper communication, the 2 other reasons for a breakdown in relationships are, 1, when students don't see their teachers as real people. Did they ever have an experience where they couldn't do their homework because they were, visiting one parent over the other and they chose to just visit? Can they understand that? And also consistency, responding to student behaviors in the same way regardless of which student performed those behaviors. What the researchers found is that students who have been identified as problems or high flyers, the teachers who have them in subsequent years have already heard their names. They are more likely to respond in a more harsh and respond more quickly to identical behaviors presented by students that have not been identified. So thinking of how am I going to respond to a student who shouts out in class? The first time, the second time, the third time, regardless of what they have done in previous years or what they did yesterday. What are my consistent responses going to be? The reason that that's important is not just for those students who have those behaviors, who have been identified, but for all of the students. Because when some students see that other students can be treated in a way that's less desirable, they become less willing to take risks in the classroom because they want to keep their status. So consistent responses. The second area you can differentiate in is content. This is really where the standards come in. Content, or basic facts, have changed, or our access to them has changed. The importance of those facts remains the same. How we assess them and how we use them has changed. For instance, it is important to know how to spell words, for sure. Anyone ever get like a text or an email with spelling errors and you're like, I cannot read this? We need to know how to spell. But that's one of those things that is spaced practice. We have tools that will help us. We can assess that in a different way than that every Friday we have this spelling test. You learn these words. You didn't learn them, you're getting a new list next week. And you won't learn those either. And then you're gonna have a kid in high school that can't spell. So we still have all that important content. We assess it differently. And that's where the standards come in. That's why the standards are largely skill-based. This is just an example. This is a format that I use when I work with districts from the start to finish with prioritizing standards and creating proficiency scales and all of that. At its simplest, and I'll walk you through this, we'll spend more time here later. You start with your standard that you're assessing. The learning intentions, that's a John Hattie term, I'll also tell you a little bit more about that later, are the different learning objectives, the different learning targets from that standard. These are the pieces that you formatively assess individually, and collectively, those pieces show whether a student is proficient on the standard. The success criteria, and you may have different terms and different ways of doing this. The success criteria is what does proficiency of these different learning intentions look like? So when we look at our assessments, we are assessing them in the same way. These are the formative assessments that align to the learning intentions and success criteria that can be used or will be used by a team to determine if those individual pieces have been met. This is not an exhaustive list because, again, we know some students are going to need additional formative assessments. That's where your teacher expertise comes in. Anything can be a formative assessment, and we're going to talk a lot about that in the second session. We just need a few that we all use so we can talk about it. And we aren't talking about huge things. It could be one question. And we're going to talk about how you make that work in the classroom, which is actually the most difficult part for many people.